This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 182 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we will be talking about 8 ways to grow your students' vocabulary. Building a robust vocabulary is an essential part of any education. The more words we know, the easier it is to absorb new ideas and navigate more complex texts and situations. We all pick up new words incidentally all the time, inside and outside of school. But if we approach vocabulary development intentionally, that growth will be exponential. The same is true in our instructional planning. Students will learn new words in our classes no matter what. But if we're deliberate about giving them regular instructional opportunities to learn them, they will learn so much more, and as a result, they'll be more likely to do better with our course material overall. In today's episode, I'll be talking about how to do that with my guest, Angela Peery. Dr. Peery is an educator and literacy expert who helps schools improve their literacy practices. She appeared in episode 171 earlier this year when we talked about how to give your school a literacy checkup. Today, we're going to talk about 8 specific strategies you can use to build your students' vocabulary in any subject area and at any grade level. The strategies are easy, they don't require a lot of prep, and because they capitalize on the simple joy of exploring how language works, they're pretty fun. First, I'd like to thank Fast IEP for sponsoring this episode. Tired of tracking IEP goals on Post-its, in notebooks, and on spreadsheets? Teachers just like you spend hundreds of unpaid hours every year creating, tracking, and reporting IEP goals. Fast IEP was created by teachers to save you time. Construct smart IEP goals for your students, track these goals with one click, and get beautiful visual reports to show their progress. Fast IEP is absolutely free forever. No paywalls, no credit card needed. Visit cultofpedagogy.com/brainpower to get started. That's cultofpedagogy.com/brainpower, BRAINPOWER. Support also comes from Applied Digital Skills, a program from Google consisting of interactive video lessons that teach practical digital skills needed for the jobs of today and tomorrow, and it's completely free. There are tons of great lessons to choose from, and students will walk away with valuable new skills like building a resume, developing a presentation, or creating a research plan. Popular lessons include using conditional formatting to create pixel art in Google Sheets, learning how to store, access, and share documents, presentations, and photos in Google Drive, and leveraging Google Slides to create an interactive if-then adventure story. You can easily integrate these lessons into your curriculum, and they work well for remote, hybrid, and in-person learning. Plus, Applied Digital Skills connects to Google Classroom, so you can seamlessly import your roster and get started in just a few clicks. To check out these easy-to-use lessons today, visit cultofpedagogy.com/digital. Now here's my interview with Angela Peery about growing students' vocabulary. Angela, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, good to be here again.
Thank you so much. And so, yes, you are definitely a repeat guest at this point. And we are going to be talking today about ways to grow students' vocabulary. So if you can just, for people who are just now like sort of meeting you for the first time, just tell us, why would you be someone to talk to me about vocabulary strategies?
Well, so I am a consultant, researcher, and author for the past 19 years. I've written several books on vocabulary instruction, 3 books, as a matter of fact. But before that, I was a middle school and high school, mostly high school, middle school and high school English language arts teacher. I also, in my current work, do a lot of working with districts and schools to evaluate their overall literacy programs. So I'm kind of a literacy geek, an experienced literacy geek, maybe we should say, and pretty well published in the field. So I hope that I have something to offer folks.
Fantastic. So you absolutely do, because I know what you're going to be offering today. And so we're going to be focusing this time on vocabulary growth, not just in English language arts classrooms, but in all subject areas. And before we get into the 8 strategies that we're going to share, let's just talk a little bit about why. Well, first of all, in your school visits, and this I wasn't planning on asking you, but I'm thinking about it now. In your school visits, do you think that vocabulary is currently being kind of underemphasized? Are you seeing, a lack of direct vocabulary instruction?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I was thinking about that this morning, and I didn't know if you were going to ask about that or not. But I was reflecting this morning. I would say in the past 2 school years, so that's including the COVID
Hmm.
lockdown, remote instruction, all that. But in the last couple of school years, I have probably done, I'd say, 2,000 classroom observations,
Hmm.
much of that, and some of it by video, some of it remotely, a lot of it in person. But I've noticed, and I don't think this is any different from years prior, but I have noticed that we often miss a lot of great opportunities to support students' vocabulary learning.
Hmm.
I think that a lot of teachers think they are teaching vocabulary, emphasizing vocabulary very explicitly. And there are just great opportunities that slide right by us in the classroom. And unless we have planned for them pretty intentionally, then they don't happen. So it's become pretty clear to me in observations and in talking with teachers that we think we're planning more vocabulary instruction than what actually happens in the classroom.
Hmm.
And if it's not a specific, for instance, if we're getting ready to read a complex text, and this is at any grade level, teachers are pretty good at previewing some vocabulary. And they're pretty good at stopping during the reading or discussion of a text and addressing vocabulary that either they've noticed or the kids have asked about. But I don't see that we're doing a lot of other things
Hmm.
to intentionally address vocabulary as much as we should be.
Okay. And what you've got here that we're going to get into in a few minutes is strategies that are not anything super crazy, super high prep, nothing that's going to require a lot of training on the teacher's part. They're pretty simple, but I think the word you use that's most important here is intentional. If you're actually planning for it, then it happens and it works. And so let's just get into this sort of the importance of vocabulary instruction. Why does it matter?
Well, I think the first association that most teachers have, and even, not teachers, just people in general, if you're talking with family members or friends, the number one thing about vocabulary is that it supports our reading comprehension. So from a very early age, any child who has a larger vocabulary is going to be a better reader, period. And children before they can read on their own, so I'm talking 3 and 4 and 5 year olds, um, the amount of words that they know and that they have in their oral language vocabulary and that they are using themselves, there's a way to grow their vocabulary too, so they are more prepared to be better readers as their reading skills kind of come along. I think as students get older, and I was thinking about this the other day too, just with adults, I travel a lot. I'm on airplanes. I'm in hotels a lot. I'm sitting around chatting with strangers. The other thing I think in your adult life is when you have a large vocabulary, it's pretty obvious from your speaking and your writing.
Mm,
And the way that you speak with others gives a first impression. It can open a lot of doors for
mm,
you. And then if you're in jobs like you and I are in, and you have to do a lot of writing for a living as well, then having that larger vocabulary, it's just like having a lot more tools in your toolkit. You can say things in more creative ways. You have
mhm,
different ways to express things, and it, and stylistically, I mean, think of any writer that you might like, that if you picked up a piece by that writer and started reading it, even without the author's name on the page, you might know who that person is from
Mm.
some of the word choice that they have and some of the stylistic, the structural decisions they make. But there's so much an enriched vocabulary can do for you in your life. Obviously, in school, reading comprehension is the number one thing.
Right. And it also just sort of supports, and it supports reading comprehension in all disciplines too. And so for students to have that background knowledge, it seems like there really has been a movement in education in the last couple of years too toward, re-evaluating the importance of just basic knowledge of things. And vocabulary is a big, big piece of that. Because if you're not familiar with terms and concepts, it's just going to slow you way, way down. So,
Absolutely. And there's
yeah.
a lot of transfer now that you brought that up. I mean, there are a lot of root words and prefixes in particular too that transfer from discipline to discipline and can help kids unlock difficult words if they have familiarity with another similar word or
Mhm.
with a word part. So, yeah, you've made a really good point that a large vocabulary is important not only in reading and writing and the disciplines that are reading and writing heavy, but it is really important across the curriculum.
Yeah. So if teachers start to employ just a little bit more intentional vocabulary instruction, they're going to see sort of improvements in their students across the board and from class to class, not even just in their own class, but it's going to support students' growth in a lot of areas. So school wide, it would actually be great if more of these strategies could be used. So these these are all coming from the books that you've written, which we are going to be linking over on my site with the blog post that you've written that outlines all of these. So if people are listening and they are liking what they hear and they want to take notes, just know that this is all going to be over on the site written out. And there will be links to Angela's books also that have many, many more because I asked her if she could just pick a few. So this is just a slice of all the different strategies. Um, so what is the first strategy?
So the first strategy we've included in the blog post is something called, not a rocket science type name. We're talking about informal conversations. So one of the best ways we can build the vocabulary of, children in our homes and our families, and also certainly children in school, is to simply pepper our conversations with interesting vocabulary words. And so this all kind of falls under a heading of what we call incidental learning, is that any person picks up from what they're listening to, what they're viewing, what they're reading, what people are talking about. We often pick up new words, and we may just remember them for a short while, or we may remember them forever. I was thinking about this morning, and I like to watch a lot of Food Network shows,
Mm.
and Chopped is just one of my favorite shows. I could
Mhm.
watch Chopped on an endless loop.
Mhm.
But I was thinking, I have learned so many cool words from watching Chopped. So I've learned cooking technique words like chiffonade and sous vide that some
Mhm.
people probably know out there. And those come from French, obviously, they sound like it, but those are cooking techniques. And then I've learned some really cool food, when they have something weird in the basket. So I've learned words like guanciale and wheat lacoche and all these interesting food words. Well, I just picked those up on my own from TV.
Mhm.
And then I can talk about them with other people who are food geeks like me. So the idea, as it applies to the classroom, would be when we're having conversations with students, so informal conversations. So if we're waiting in the hallway, we're lining up and going to lunch, or for elementary teachers that have the bathroom break twice a day and they're out
Mhm.
in the hallway, if we're talking with kids in the cafeteria while lunch is going on, if we have snack time in our class, just any informal conversation. So, not a moment when you are explicitly trying to teach vocabulary or reading, but just in conversation. And I think about it a lot. My students used to think it was really funny. I used to, how you'd have to get a kid to run something down to the office or something like that. And I would use all sorts of different words for the act of walking. So I would say things to them like why don't you saunter on down to the office and take
Mm.
this thing for me? Or, and I find all
Mhm.
these synonyms for walking or talking or things that we were normally doing in the class.
Yeah.
And I'd say them so often that they thought it was dorky, and they'd say, what are
Yeah.
you talking about? And even with walking, I'd have to kind of act it out or something. And then I'd do it enough that kids would, it would be funny. And I taught ninth and 10th grade. So, let's say the tardy bell would ring or something, a kid would walk in late and I'd say, hey, what are you doing? You're late to my class. And he'd say, oh, I finally decided it was time to saunter on in here, or
That's
something
nice.
like that. But,
Yes, yes.
but
And when
see,
they start mimicking you, they're actually using the word, which is perfect. That's what you want.
that's exactly it. I mean,
Mhm.
think about what little kids do when they're first learning language from their family members, right? They mimic
Mhm.
unfamiliar words, but then they figure out what the meaning is. So this is a great strategy, especially I when I've done observations in preschool classrooms. So with 4-year-olds and certainly with 5-year-olds, we have snack time, we have wait for lunch, we have go to the bathroom together. We have all these times where
Mhm.
the teachers could be talking, but sprinkling those unfamiliar words and kind of cool words in there. I know my kids used to also love the word persnickety when I used it.
Mhm.
Like I would
Mhm.
start a list on chart paper or something every year, and they want to call it weird words that Miss Perry uses.
Yeah.
So if I would say a word like bamboozled or persnickety, they'd really like it, and we'd put it up on that chart. But so then some kids would learn them and use them, but it was okay if they did, it was okay if they didn't.
Right.
The idea was, hey, that's a cool word there for the taking if you want it.
Right. And if it's been part of their just ambient environment, then it's going in anyway, whether they start using it or not. What I
Right.
really like about this one too is that I think when I was full time teaching in the classroom, I didn't always think about those interstitial times as instructional opportunities. I thought of it as a way to sort of influence maybe their personalities and their attitudes, but I don't think I made the connection. So I think this is really good, especially for teachers who feel like they're strapped for time or whatever, that it can be happening all the time.
And I want to put a plug in here too for social emotional learning and building relationships and all
Mm,
that. That's not separate from using really cool vocabulary words.
mm,
So when
mhm,
you're talking to kids when they're wandering around the hallway, like maybe you have to stand at your door in the morning before they all get into class. I know at middle and high schools we have to do that a lot. So all those times when kids are just passing by or passing through or just having conversation with them about whatever you want to have conversation with them about,
mhm.
that shows them there's a caring adult who wants to talk with them. But if we can also sprinkle those really cool words in there, then it's kind of what I call a double whammy.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that was the only one that we're talking about that is part of the incidental stuff. The next six that we're going to talk about are all going to be the explicit strategies that are planned and structured. And so, strategy number two is going to be an explicit strategy. And what is that?
Yeah, so strategy number two, you've probably done something like it, but it actually has a name called anchored word learning. And this is in the work of Isabel Beck and her colleagues. So if you're really a vocabulary nerd like I am, you definitely want to read all the stuff Isabel Beck has written over the years. Terrific stuff. But anchored word learning is basically when you're going to do a read aloud, especially with younger children, or you're using a picture book as the text. You can certainly adapt this for older students as well. But the idea is to pick three or no more than five, or her original work said three, but 3 to 5 words that are general academic terms. So these are not obscure words. These are not words that are specific only to that text. That's how I screwed it up when I was an English teacher. Let's say I was getting ready to teach a short story. I was going to read the first 5 or 6 paragraphs out loud. Then I was going to have the kids finish the story on their own. I would do that pre-teaching of the vocabulary that was in my
Mhm.
textbook back in those days. And sometimes those are just kind of strange words.
Mhm.
They're telling you a word that you might not know. It's probably you're going to see it in that story, but maybe not in a lot of other places. And I would spend an inordinate amount of time talking about the weird words.
Yeah,
It,
some like
it,
medieval tool that they're using and an
yeah,
auger or something. It's
yeah,
like, yeah,
like something in an Edgar Allan Poe story that
right.
the cask of Amontillado. Let's say it's something to do
Yes.
with wine, and they're never,
Yes.
So the idea. So this is the brilliance of what Beck studied and her colleagues. It is to pick just a handful of words that are general academic terms, which means they have a wider application. Because
Mm,
those, we want to expand our students' vocabulary of general academic terms that are going to cut across the disciplines
hmm.
and not just the obscure or fascinating words, certainly that your English teacher is fascinated with, like I was. So we walk through a process in the blog post. This is how Beck recommends it be done. And that is basically, look at your read aloud beforehand, identify just a few words, mark the words in the text. The important part, and I've got to caution people on this because I see this happen in classrooms all the time. You might want to have those words posted before the story, or you might want to mention them briefly, but the kids need to hear a fluent reading of the entire text.
So
So
you're not stopping. Yeah.
no, you don't want to stop in the middle of, I've watched lovely kindergarten and first grade teachers, especially, some of these picture books are so wonderful. And I'm really getting into the character or the story or what's going on. And then either they stop or one of the kids ask a question and they spend 5 minutes on one of the pages that has
Mm,
a strange word on it. Instead of like, let's go through the entire text first, and it is
yes.
important for those young listeners to hear the teacher read that text fluently. That's a little bit lesser important as kids get older because their comprehension is not going to be as interrupted. But we want to read the text fluently first.
Hmm.
Then, and this is in the blog post. So after reading the text all the way through one time, then go back and focus on the targeted words and have your
Yes.
students say them. Make sure the word is visible. Give them a student friendly definition, maybe some examples, so that those words start to get into their consciousness.
Hmm. Okay, what is strategy number 3?
So, strategy 3 is a little bit of an adaptation of something folks might be familiar with if they already use academic word walls. And it's called a tip chart, TIP. I learned this strategy from a friend and colleague named Susie Pepper Rollins. And her book will be linked there at the end of the blog post. But a tip chart is a 3-column chart. So, it can be up on the wall, it can be digitally in each kid's digital notebook. There's a lot of ways to use it. But it's really great to use when there are some hefty content terms that kids have to know. I work a lot with high schools, so I'm thinking like a high school economics class where there's
Hmm.
all this terminology about supply and demand and commodities and
Hmm.
monopolies. And there's all these legal terms. And look what's going on now that it'd be great to talk about supply chain issues and all that.
Right.
So a tip chart is really great when you have quite a few words that need to be learned, and they're probably conceptually related. So they're all together in a chapter, or they're all together in a unit, or they all have something to do with, let's say, supply and demand.
Hmm.
And you put this 3-column chart up on a bulletin board, up on the wall. Again, it can become virtual as kids get used to it, but there's great support for kids in class when they can just look up and see some of those words, because then they can use them in their speaking and their writing in the class. So the far left hand column is for the term itself. You want to make sure it's written really large so that the kids can see what the word looks like, how it's spelled properly, all that. The middle column is for information. So that would be a brief, student friendly summary or definition or something, not what's in the glossary of the textbook, or not what a full definition is, but a version kids understand and can look at this chart and take it in really easily and understand that definition. And then some kind of graphic, some kind of picture. I've got in the blog post one that is very similar to something I used in class, because My kids knew any graphic I was going to use was probably some form of stick figure. That's about the
Hmm.
extent of my artistic ability. So in the post, we have an example of soliloquy. That is a term my students had to learn when we were doing a drama unit. So we had to learn terms like soliloquy, monologue, stage directions. I'm trying to think what else, that
Yeah.
you don't have when you're reading other types of literature. So if I had a tip chart up on the wall during the Julius Caesar or Romeo and Juliet unit or whatever it was, then I might have something like what's in the blog post. Soliloquy is the term. It says when someone in the play thinks out loud. And then there's just a stick figure with, if I have lines coming out of something on my stick figures, my students knew that either meant like movement or talking.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
that's my great artwork. But I've seen a lot of teachers do these very well, and then the terminology stays visible to the
Hmm.
students until they don't need that support anymore.
Right. Gosh, I keep trying to think about how can we do this if we're still virtual? And I'm imagining even like I'm looking right now at a bulletin board behind
You
my
could do a
computer.
Padlet. You could
You
do Pad.
can, but I'm even thinking students can almost replicate some of the things that a teacher might have hanging on their wall. You can have that be a lesson. I want everybody to get a sheet of paper out. We're going to copy this down, and I want you to get a piece of tape or something and
Yep.
stick this on the wall because we don't have a physical classroom right now. And that because the idea what you were saying is having it up where you're kind of inadvertently seeing it every now and then, and it's just sinking in.
Well,
There's a
let's
lot of
think
value
about
to that.
let's think about this for a minute, because you and I are recording and we're each looking at a screen. And so a
Hmm.
kid who might be at home looking at a screen doing schoolwork, I don't know about you, but when I'm getting ready to record or attend, something virtual where I am supposed to be learning and remembering things,
Hmm.
I've got stuff. There's a big computer screen behind me that we don't use anymore, a large desktop, and I will tape things on it. So,
Yes.
so just like, because when I look up, I can see it. So if I'm
Right.
talking to you right now and I wanted to make a certain point, I might have that written really large
Yeah.
in Sharpie marker, and it's up there so I don't forget to say it.
Yeah.
So I think that's a similar idea.
Right, right. You can almost sort of recreate kind of the things you'd have in a classroom in the physical space at home, and recognizing that tons of kids may not be able to do that based on
Right,
their
right.
situation, but it's an idea anyway. Um, okay, so tip charts, that was number 3. And these, I mean, are these done as a whole class? Is this a lesson, or is this something that kids are keeping on their own, or both?
I think with the tip chart, it's kind of like if you're trying to teach kids a note taking method or something, you've got to front load it and model
Mhm.
it a lot at the beginning, and then gradually they can become more independent with it. So maybe they can start, for each chapter, like I would do it at the beginning of a chapter or unit together, put it on the wall, spend time
Mhm.
talking about it, that kind of thing. Then probably do that for a couple of units or a couple of chapters. Then maybe the third time around, say, hey, I want you guys to start keeping these in your notebook. Let's do the first two together. And then I want you to work on these 5 terms, with a partner or
Mhm.
something. Like
Mhm.
I think of that whole gradual release of responsibility of I have to get them to do it with me and see a person who's competent in doing it enough times that then you hope it becomes a strategy they can also do more independently.
Yes. All right. Strategy number 4.
Strategy 4 is Save the Last Word for Me by Kylene Beers. All of her work, if you know, in adolescent literacy is quite wonderful.
Mhm.
It's usually applied to when a group of students or when a whole class has read something together and then we sit and discuss it. And the person who posed the question or made the statement or whatever, they let all their classmates in the small group talk about it first and then they go last. And that's why it's called Save the Last Word for Me. But as applied to vocabulary, what we would do as a teacher is to have some vocabulary words and physically have them on index cards or cut out sentence strips or something like that.
Mhm.
And they'd be, let's say there's 10. Let's go back to my drama unit I always did in ninth and 10th grade English. So perhaps at the end of the Romeo Juliet and Juliet unit in ninth grade, there were 10 literary terms that I wanted to make sure my students knew before we had whatever the summative assessment was. So I would take those 10 literary terms, or maybe just five, and there'd be different bags with five different ones in there. And I would put those terms on the front of an index card. I'd write the term pretty large. On the flip side, I would write probably a student friendly definition. I'd write something about how we talked about it in class. I might give some examples of it. Then
Mhm.
I'd put my students into groups and we would take turns. So the first, let's go with the word soliloquy.
Mhm.
So the first student has the Ziploc bag or the envelope or whatever and holds up the word soliloquy facing the rest of the students. So that person who drew the word can see what's on the back, the definition,
Mhm.
the examples that we talked, whatever we talked about in class, some
Mhm.
context. And that person would let every other person in his or her group then speak about that term. So maybe the first person would say, "Oh, a soliloquy. I don't remember much about that. I think it's when someone's alone on the stage. That's all I
Mhm.
remember."
Mhm.
And then the second person might say, "Oh, yeah, it's when a person's alone on the stage and they're speaking out loud so that you can hear what's in their mind." And then the
Mhm.
third person might say, "Yeah, and Shakespeare used soliloquies to help us understand blah, blah, blah." And then the fourth person might say, "Oh, I think that was a really good soliloquy. You know, when Juliet was talking on the balcony, she didn't know
Mhm.
Romeo could hear her yet, right?" Then it
Mhm.
finally, now it's back to the original person that pulled the term. So that person says whatever else they want to say about it or sums it up. So now, and then passes the bag, takes that term out, passes the bag around, and somebody pulls another one. So it's really, now there's all sorts of ways you could alter it. You could have kids choosing some of their own terms, and, maybe I get to put the term up that I want to hear my friends talk about.
Mhm.
Maybe we all, there's all sorts of great variations, but basically it is to get kids talking together about important terminology.
Yeah. This sounds like the kind of thing that would require some training, like a fishbowl maybe where you have a few students doing
Yeah,
it at for the whole class to watch. Otherwise, I can see them being like, "What do we even say? I don't even know what we're supposed to say." So seeing an
absolutely.
example would be, yeah.
I would, now that you said that, it reminds me very much of when I used to do literature circles in my English classes. And we always took a day or two to kind of fishbowl, like, what does it mean if I'm going to be serving in the role of summarizer? Or what does it mean if I'm going to be serving in the role
Yep.
of the word wizard or whatever they were? And so I'd call kids, we do like almost like where you have your bell ringer maybe at the beginning
Mhm.
of class. So we
Mhm.
do about 10 minutes of modeling and then we wouldn't do it that day. And then the next
Right.
day we might do 5 or 10 more minutes of modeling and we wouldn't do it that day. But then the third day they have to come in and they have to do it in groups.
Yeah. I
So
mean, the
yeah,
amount of time you could save yourself and hassle putting that work in at the beginning. I feel like that's such an important lesson for especially new teachers. The number of times that things like that went haywire for me because I didn't do that kind of modeling at the beginning, and then you're just putting out fires
well, I'm,
constantly.
I'm glad you brought that up too, because this is one of the only strategies, except for the word talks. So the important thing about this strategy is that kids are talking about the important terminology in a non-teacher directed way.
Mm,
That's what we like. They can't move a term into long term memory.
yeah.
You can memorize something for a quiz or a test or something, but unless you sit there and struggle with it, now we want them struggling productively. So if that
Hmm.
first student says, "I don't remember anything about this except that it's one person on a stage," like,
Right.
there's that stick person on the wall and that tip chart, and that's all I know. Like, I
Yeah.
can't, whatever. And then the second person, can add to that, and the third, like, it is it's to allow students to talk about the words so that hopefully they're making more connections and they're getting them in their brains more deeply than if they were just listening to me review the terms.
Yes. Yes. Because they're having to actually generate some fresh stuff, even if it's to just say what you just said. That not only that, but I think the hearing of a peer doing that is another novel experience with
Yep.
that word that's gonna stick with more kids. So
Yep.
Okay. All right, we're halfway through. What's number 5?
Strategy 5 is a pretty, this one requires some preparation. We've called
Mhm.
it vocabulary mini lessons here. So, what I've shared is from my books called Vocabulary in a Snap. These are 10 to 15-minute mini lessons that teachers can conduct on whatever kind of basis they want to conduct them. I know a lot of people that do like a words on Wednesday and do one of
Mm.
these little mini lessons every week. I know some other teachers that do them twice a week. I know some other teachers that just do them sporadically. But if you're looking for a structure for a vocabulary mini lesson, the structure, the acronym SNAP, is about the structure. And what you do is you ensure that the kids can see the word. So it's just what these lessons are actually about, grouping some words together strategically that have either a common part or some kind of conceptual commonality. Because that's how we kind of file things in our brains, is we file them with like things. So maybe if I'm learning words that have the prefix PRE, I can,
Mhm.
maybe I knew two of them in that group, but I didn't know the other two. But now maybe I can start to remember the other two because they were kind of like the two that I already knew. So the premise of the structure is that kids need to see the word, what it looks like in writing and spelling. They need to say the words out loud because we often think kids can pronounce even difficult words correctly, and I can't tell you how many high school biology classrooms I've been in that the kids can't say endoplasmic reticulum and they call it the ER, and I'm like, no, the ER is
Mhm.
something else. That's not that, right?
Yeah.
So we've got to see the word, say the word, try to place them in a category. So naming a commonality or placing them in some kind of category. Then the last two stages are called acting on the words, and that's kind of when the kids do something informal and fun and quick with each other. And then the P is for producing some kind of individual application of the word. So either you write your own sentence with it, you turn and talk and make up something that applies that word and tell a partner, you jot a note down, something like that. So you can move through these steps pretty quickly. These do have to be planned in advance. We've given a sample in the blog post of some words that share the root word DICT. So indict, indictment, dictum, jurisdiction, and verdict.
Mhm.
Um, so kids might know one or two of those words, and they might not know the others because they're more uncommon and more difficult. But this particular lesson shared in the blog post is the commonality is the root,
Yeah.
and the root can help kids understand all the words with that root. But in the books, we have over 100 of these lessons already planned out for teachers.
And when I saw how this example actually rolled out, it made me realize that it doesn't, it isn't all that difficult when you talk about. So you've got, I'm going to review the 4 letters. See, the S is to see it and say it. The N is to name the category that it belongs to or notice connections related to other words. The A is acting on the word, some sort of a brief task. And then P is produce, to produce some sort of application. um, so you've got this collection of words. So the students, you would first say and understand the definition for indict, indictment, dictum, jurisdiction, and verdict. The next step, the N step, in terms of naming and noticing, uh, you would then talk about the category that it belongs to and kind of help them to see the connections, right?
Right. And and these are legal words, and we might have a quick little discussion about anything they might know from the news. And then, indict and indictment are related
Mm-hmm.
to each other. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
kids don't know that once you add a suffix, like sometimes they think a base word is not, if it's got a suffix on it, it's an entirely different thing. And it's
Right.
not. So you might have a
Right.
little discussion of that.
Mm-hmm. And so then the A step, the action step, this is a very simple activity. You've just got the phrases, and then like a person was charged with murder, and then that would be matched with another card or something that has indict or indictment on it.
Right.
Or, so basically matching the words with their definitions, it looks like.
Yeah, like a little
Yeah.
quick example, you could pop those up on a Google slide or something
Hmm.
and have kids just turn and talk with each other. Which one goes with which thing?
Yeah. Yep. It's just a little processing. And then the produce step, the P, you could have students basically answer. You've got a list of questions basically for students to answer in complete sentences. If you could issue a dictum today for all teachers in this school, what would you say? What is something you would like to be part of in your jurisdiction, part of your jurisdiction that currently is not? And so you're really just giving a little, yeah. When I first saw that P, that they have to produce something new, I'm like, is this like a poster or something? But this is pretty quick and simple, and it
And
would
those can
stick.
also be turn and talk if you don't want kids to write them down. They just
Right.
turn to a partner and actually say, oh, if I could issue, I kind of want to hear them say the word. If I could
Yes.
issue a dictum in this school, I would make all teachers hand us a soda when we get to class. That would be great.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Exactly. And that's gone through their brain in that new way.
Right.
All right. So that was strategy number 5, mini lessons.
And it's supposed to be playful and fun.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
I've never seen this, and I hope I will never hear of this, of some teacher somewhere saying, okay, it's Friday. We're going to do the SNAP lesson today. You know, get out your SNAP notebook and no, it's supposed to be playful and fun and light and talkative. And if they don't learn all those words, guess what? They were just exposed to them all. They might remember some, they might not, but it's just you are explicitly teaching, but it's probably more about incidental learning. Like, do they pick it up or do they not?
Yeah.
But that's the idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Number 6.
Number 6 is called in the research. It's called vocabulary self collection strategy. When I
Hmm.
did things like this in my own classroom, I just called them a vocabulary log. And
Okay.
this is about students finding their own words. Um, so it pairs really nicely with independent reading. Um, the requirement in my class was students had to have an independent reading book at all times. And they also had to be, every few weeks we would talk about what new words they had gathered from reading, listening, watching, being in conversations, whatever. But that's really this idea. So it's about students um, encountering some words on their own, but then, recording them. So having a notebook, whether that's physical or digital, deciding on which words, I'm trying to think of a text I read recently and if I got any new words from it. I seem to get a lot of new words if I go to a doctor's appointment when you're sitting there in the room waiting for the
Mm.
doctor to come in and they've got all those posters and charts and things all
Yeah.
around. And I'm always looking at them, and I remember years ago, do you know what the name of the blood pressure machine is?
No.
Like it's something like sphygmomanometer or something like it was
Yeah.
it was such a weird word. I just kept
Mhm.
looking at it and I wanted to remember it. So this is kind of that idea. You encounter a word somewhere, you want to write it down because you want to remember it. So you put it in some sort of format where you have the word, you've got the definition, you've got a little bit of context from, where you got it. I used to also make my students try to use the word themselves in a sentence, try to apply
Mm.
it.
Mhm.
Some teachers do this. Like I said, there's lots of hard copy and digital ways you could do it, but it's basically setting it up so that your kids can collect words they are interested in. Now, it dovetails nicely into strategy 7, word talks.
Mhm.
So, where a kid, and I use the example in the blog post if anybody's watched the TV show Atypical, which I think is fabulous.
Yes, same
The
here. Yeah.
character Sam, the character Sam is incredibly interested in Antarctica and Antarctic exploration
Mhm.
and Antarctic animals, especially penguins. And so he
Penguins.
has a lot of specialized knowledge
Mhm.
that he has sought out on his own. So if Sam would have been in my high school class, his vocabulary self collection, he kept notebooks on everything. He'd love to catalog information and So he would have loved this as an assignment in class. In his vocabulary notebook, there would have just been scores of words related to that interest of his, and probably not only the words and the definitions and an example, but probably some art to go with it as well.
Yep.
So then if it was time to have word talks in class, and I used to schedule like every week we'd have two students do a word talk. And this would be, 10 minutes on a Friday or something. And the students could get up and share a few words that they had found recently that they thought were interesting and that they had learned, and maybe words that they thought other people should learn too, because that's the filter I always put on it in my class was, I want you to share some words that other ninth graders or 10th graders or eighth graders who have. Why should anybody else need to know this word?
Mm-hmm.
And again, that character Sam, I'm sure he'd want us to know a lot of words about penguins or something, even if we weren't interested in them. But that's fine,
Yeah.
because he owns those words,
Mm-hmm.
and he would explain them to us, and it might pique some other kids' interest. But the bottom line is that, you know, there's another premise that runs through a lot of these strategies, and it's that we can learn words from listening to other people.
Absolutely. Yes.
And if we don't let students talk, and if we don't let them talk about interesting stuff, stuff they're interested in,
Right.
then how is, like, I would never, one thing my students always taught me, I'm not big into R&B and hip hop and stuff, and my students would teach me a lot about that world, you
Yeah.
know. And I remember years ago, this is how long ago it was, I'm been teaching so long. I heard somebody mention the other day the TV show South Park, and I would have never ever watched an episode of South Park. I don't like animation. I would have, but I had students that were coming in and talking about it, and they said, "Miss Peery, you should watch South Park. You will really like it. It's about school." And so so
Yep.
if we never, we've got to let them have some conversation about their interest,
Right.
and then somebody else might have an interest in Antarctica or whatever it is as well, and might go seek out some more about that interest if they hear their peer talking about it.
Yeah. Gosh, this is making me think too about how many words I have learned from my three teenagers in the
Mm.
past. I mean, just keeping up sort of with the slang that they use.
Oh yeah.
And that's vocabulary too, to be our age and to know the words that they're using, that's also powerful to actually at least understand what they're talking about.
Well,
Yeah.
you're making me laugh now because we have some friends, and they have children who are 9 and 11,
Mhm.
very bright little fellas and very well read. And, when the word bougie first came out, like they taught me, I was like, you mean like bourgeois? Is that where it comes from? And bourgeoisie from the French, like I said, like we had a whole conversation, and
And
they,
it does though, right?
yeah, it
But
does.
they
But
probably don't know that word though.
they didn't know. So they said, Miss Angela, we don't know what you're talking about. I said, well, I'm going to talk to you about where that word comes from, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So again, teachers, sometimes we shut down, like you just said, like if it's something way outside of the content of our class, or it's something about slang, or it's something about music, or, we're kind of quick sometimes to shut that down
Yeah.
when it could be a real cool vocabulary learning experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so just to sort of review those last two, because so the vocabulary self collection strategy is an ongoing thing that students do independently with support from the teacher. And then that can also connect really nicely with strategy 7, the word talks, which are also kind of ongoing because you're not going to have your whole class do it all in one day. They're sort of done intermittently by individual students.
Right.
Okay. So we are down to number 8.
Yeah, the last thing is I just wanted to offer some tools for kids to practice vocabulary on their own. I know a lot of teachers use Flowcabulary, which is a site that has, it started off a few years back, mostly with just some videos about important terminology. And that's kind of set to hip hop type songs, and they're animated. And so kids will pay attention to them. The site has become more robust. And so if you haven't looked at it in a while, I would certainly suggest that. I've also suggested Vocabador, which is an app, and you get to pick, you're like a wrestler and you're wrestling against other wrestlers to see who wins, but it's all about practicing vocabulary words. So those two, people might not be familiar with Vocabador. But a lot of people are familiar with vocabulary, but I wanted to put a plug to check it out again. But my absolute favorite, and everywhere I go, there's adults who love this, kids who love this. My absolute favorite is Free Rice. So it's just those two words run together,
Mm-hmm.
freerice.com. Free Rice has a lot of subjects you can practice with there, but the vocabulary game is just incredibly addictive. And so basically it just gives you a word and it says such and such means, and then you pick from four choices. So
Mm-hmm.
it's just a phrase or a synonym, it's either a single word or a phrase. And every time you get one right, you will see rice going into a bowl.
Mm-hmm.
And what that does, like that I've had teachers tell me it's very motivating to their kids to see that rice keep dropping in the bowl. And they get really excited when the bowl fills up. But it's not just rice dropping in a bowl on a screen. It is actually part of the United Nations World Food Program. So every time you get a word right, there's an actual grain of rice that is donated to this program. So the playing the game helps feed people in underdeveloped nations.
Hmm.
And I've had teachers tell me that their kids get really excited about that too, that they really enjoy knowing that they're helping other people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, the vocabulary game used to have like 55 levels in the old version, and I used to really get excited when I got up to level 50 or 51 and I was doing pretty well. They've revamped it in the last few years, and the vocabulary game now only has 5 levels. And I'm
Okay.
warning you, if you're an adult, you're a well educated person listening to this podcast, you're an educator, don't start with level 5.
Oh,
It,
it's
it,
hard.
it's very difficult.
Okay.
Very difficult. I usually start myself on level 3 and then try to go up to level 4. And when I start with level 5, I get half of them wrong. So,
Wow.
and I'm a person who's written books on vocabulary, so I love
Right.
words, right? But start your kids down at level 1 if they're elementary. It's really only appropriate. I wouldn't do it below about grade 3 for sure, maybe grade 4. But then your
Okay.
middle school students, you could start them at level 1 or 2, and then high school students, you could probably start at level 2. And the other caution you just might need to know, I'm not seeing as many problems with it lately, but since it's run by the United Nations, it is a British. Sometimes there's
Hmm.
a British spelling.
Okay. So as long as people know that going
Yeah,
into it,
and it
then
can
yeah.
throw the kids off. They might call you over and say, you know, why is this word spelled like that? Is that the same?
Yeah.
And it might like an OUR on the end of flavor or something.
Right, right.
But it does use British spelling. But
Okay.
I've sat many a times in the airport and played about an hour of free rice, and it's really a lot of fun.
Oh, that's cool. I've never played it, but I remember people mentioning it a couple years ago. And so now I kind of want to get on and try it. Um,
I highly recommend it. And you're not just killing time and
right.
exercising your brain, which is also good. You're helping donate. It's independently. You don't have to look at ads or anything. It is funded by donors, and you are actually helping feed people.
Awesome. So this is just a really nice supplement to all the other strategies you're talking about, to just when kids have some free time or whatever, that's something that you can give them to do that's productive as opposed to just putting their heads on the desks or,
Yeah,
whatever. Yeah.
I met a teacher just recently, and I got really excited because she says we have free rice Fridays. So
Oh, wow.
every Friday they have like 20 minutes, and you can choose, like most of her kids do the math practice that's on there, but some of hers
Yeah.
do the vocabulary, but they get 20 minutes every Friday to play free rice. And when she said, guys, remember it's free rice Friday, I mean, this is like fifth graders, and they went, yay, they were
Yeah.
so excited. I was like,
Yeah.
yay.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Okay, well, this is good. We've got these 8 strategies. You've got a really nice detailed blog post that goes through all of these. So if people like these ideas, and I hope they do, they can go over and take a look at those. And thanks so much for sharing this with us.
Well, as always, it is a pleasure. It's an honor to be associated with you and for my work to be on the Cult of Pedagogy site. And I'm excited that we got to collaborate again, and thanks for having me.
Thank you. To read Angela's blog post outlining these 8 strategies, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 182. To get a bi-monthly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, courses, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.